When they crucified my Lord, were you there when they crucified my Lord? Sometimes it causes me tremble. Oh, tremble. When they crucified my Lord, were you there when he rose up from the tomb? Were you there when he rose up from the tomb? Oh, sometimes it causes me to tremble. Oh, tremble, tremble. I'd like to have been there when he rose up from the tomb. Jesus paid it all. To him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, but he washed it white as snow. And Lord, in everything that I say and do, I'm still trying to say thanks for the things you have done for me. Things so undeserved. Yet you give, and you give, and you give to prove your love for me. The voices of a million angels cannot express my gratitude for all that I am and ever hope to be. Lord, I know I owe it all to thee. For to God be the glory, to my God be all the glory, to God be the glory for the things you have done.
John's Gospel, like the other three, tells the story of Jesus, covering much of the same ground, yet it is strikingly different to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Throughout the entire book, John concentrates more on the meaning of what happened. The signs which showed most clearly who Jesus was, and the great keynote of John's Gospel is love. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life.
The story of Jesus does not begin with the virgin birth, but this gospel concerns the Word, God's shared nature, God's executive in creation. When God spoke, his word brought life itself into existence. But here is the stupendous truth. The same word became a human being in the person of Jesus Christ. He lived among us. We saw his glory. His life shone out against the darkness of a world which largely failed to recognize him.
Now,
Behold the Lamb of God.
Time measured out my days. Life carried me along. In my soul I yearned to follow God, but knew I'd never be so strong. I looked out at this world to learn how heaven could be gained. Just when the end came, between human error is all in vain. Were it not for grace, I can tell you where I'd be, wandering down some pointless road to nowhere, with my salvation up to me, and I know how that would go. The battles I will face, forever running, but losing the race, were it not for grace. So here is all my praise, expressed with all my heart, offered to a friend who took my place and ran a course I could not start, and when he saw in full just how much his love would cost. He still went the final mile between me and heaven, so I would not be lost. Were it not for grace, I can tell you where I'd be, but I'll be wandering down some pointless road to nowhere, with my salvation up to me, and I know how that would go. Every single battle I would face, forever running but losing the race, were it not for grace. Forever running, losing the race, were it not for grace.
After Jesus had eaten the Last Supper with his disciples, he went with them from Jerusalem across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden. Because Jesus often met there with his disciples, Judas also knew of the garden and brought a detachment of soldiers along with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees. Jesus knew what was about to happen. He stepped forward and asked, and they answered. Jesus replied. Again Jesus asked them, and they said, Jesus answered. Then Simon Peter drew his sword and cut off the right ear of Malchus, the slave of the high priest. Jesus said to Peter,
My name is Dr. Sapphire Feldman. I am a professor of archaeology at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Allow me to describe what happened to Jesus. The Gospel of John says that Jesus and his disciples walked from the city across the Kidron Valley to a garden. That means Jesus headed east out of Jerusalem, went down a steep slope, and crossed a creek that was at the bottom of a wide ravine known as Kidron. Although John does not mention the name of the garden, the other gospel writers do. They say that the garden was called Gethsemane, located on the Mount of Olives. This so-called mount was the hill on the opposite side of the ravine. The slopes were filled with groves of olive trees. The distance Jesus traveled from the city down into the valley and up the other side was likely no further than 1 mile. While at the garden, Judas, the betrayer, arrived with 3 groups of men. A few Roman soldiers who were probably there to keep the peace in case a riot ensued, the police of the chief priests who were there to arrest Jesus because he claimed to be the Son of God, and the Pharisees, a few members of the religious party who studied and interpreted the law Jesus regularly violated. It was not often that Roman soldiers would be part of the same action as the police of the chief priests, but in this case, the police wanted to make an arrest, and the Romans who came along were afraid that the arrest would cause a fight which would need to be contained. Apparently, the disciples were prepared to fight, for Peter sliced off the ear of a chief priest slave before Jesus was taken away.
So Jesus was arrested by the soldiers and the Jewish police. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas. Annas questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teachings. Jesus said, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temples, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing secretly. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me. What I said to them, they know what I said." When Jesus finished speaking, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, Jesus answered, Then Annas kept Jesus bound and sent him to
Annas was appointed high priest by Quirinius, the governor of Syria. Annas served in that important position as the leader of the Sanhedrin for 9 years. 5 of Annas's sons, as well as 1 grandson, succeeded him as high priest. And at the time of the arrest of Jesus, Annas's son-in-law, Caiaphas, was high priest. But Annas also carried the title in an honorary manner. Clearly, Annas was one of the most influential religious leaders of the day, both by way of influence and family connections. It was to him that Jesus was brought and interrogated. In John's Gospel, we have no record of Caiaphas questioning Jesus, only that Annas sent him to his son-in-law. The other Gospels tell of Jesus before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, the priestly body that condemned Jesus to death. Caiaphas was high priest for 18 years. Some time ago, while building a highway, bulldozers in Jerusalem uncovered a tomb. The inscription on the ossuary, the stone crypt, indicates that it is the tomb for the family of Caiaphas. It even has bones inside.
Then they took Jesus to Pilate's headquarters early in the morning, because they did not wish to become ritually defiled. The religious leaders did not enter the headquarters themselves. So Pilate went out to them and asked. They answered, Pilate replied, The crowd replied, We are not permitted to put anyone to death. Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him,
Are you the king of the Jews?
Jesus answered, Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me? Pilate replied,
I am not a Jew, am I?
Jesus answered, My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Pilate asked him. Jesus answered, You say that I am king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify of the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. So Pilate asked him,
What is truth?
The headquarters of Pilate is often referred to as the Praetorium. Because it was the Passover and they wished to remain ritually clean, the religious leaders did not enter the Roman headquarters. Pilate was the Roman procurator of Judea for 10 years. He was often a hard, mean-spirited man who despised his Jewish subjects. His interest in Jesus was only that of political expediency. Part of the story deals with who had jurisdiction over the death of Jesus. Pilate tried to get the religious leaders to take care of the matter themselves, but because there was a Roman ruling that said only Roman authority had jurisdiction over capital cases, the chief priest sought favor with the Romans and deferred to their authority to put Jesus to death. Therefore, Jesus was condemned to die, not by the Jewish method of stoning, but by the Roman method of crucifixion.
After Pilate completed his interrogation of Jesus, he went outside to the Jews and said, the crowd shouted, "Now Barabbas, he was a bandit."
We have no evidence outside of all four Gospels of a Passover tradition in which a criminal was released, but this custom is likely because it would have made political points with people Pilate did not like. The ridicule and disdain could be heard in Pilate's voice when he referred to Jesus as their king. Barabbas is said to have been a bandit. Other written sources of the time use the Greek word for bandit to describe political criminals. The description of Barabbas in the other Gospels seems to support this view. Therefore, it is likely that Barabbas was a Jewish zealot who sought the overthrow of a Roman rule. How ironic that a real political criminal would be released over Jesus, whom the religious leaders had portrayed as a political criminal against Rome, even though Pilate said they didn't have a case.
Pilate had Jesus flogged. The soldiers wove together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. Then they dressed him in purple. They kept coming up to him and taunting him, "Hail, hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him on the face. Pilate again appeared to the crowd and said, So Jesus came out, wearing a crown of thorns and a purple robe. Pilate said, when the chief priest and the police saw him, they shouted, Pilate became afraid and after questioning Jesus again, tried to release him. But the Jews cried out, So about noon, Pilate said, Pilate asked them. The chief priests answered, We have no king but the emperor. My name is Dr. Darrell O'Connor. I have been a medical examiner and pathologist for 24 years. As one who has spent years researching causes of death, I have studied the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus from a medical perspective. The pain of Jesus began even before he was nailed to the cross. When the soldiers flogged him, they lightly used a whip with metal pieces attached at the end of each strip of leather. When struck on the back, the metal would have served as small knives that filleted the flesh and left it in bloody strips. When the robe was placed on Jesus, the blood would have coagulated and dried against the fabric. Every time Jesus moved, the wounds would have reopened and torn. The damage to the head of Jesus would depend upon how hard the crown of thorns was pressed into his skull. He also took repeated blows to the face as the soldiers mocked him.
Hear the cries of the shackled from the onset of time, or the chains of defeat. There's no key. See the tears of the broken. Hear the cries of the slaves. Is there no one worthy to set us free?
Then the crying is stilled as the chorus rings out. The shackled released from their chains. Thousands of voices are swelling the song. Worthy the Lamb that was slain.
Worthy the Lamb that was slain.
Sing it with us.
Worthy the Lamb that
which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified Jesus along with two others, one on either side of him. Pilate had an inscription affixed to the cross that was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, the inscription was read by many. It said, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews."
It was customary for the Romans to crucify people next to roads so that those passing could see what could happen if Rome was defiled. In John's Gospel, Jesus is made to carry his own cross. We cannot know if he carried all of the cross or just the beam to which his arms would be nailed. Nor do we know the location of Golgotha, despite what tourists to the Holy Land are told. Apparently, Golgotha was a dome-shaped hill that resembled a skull. In 1968, building contractors working in a suburb north of Jerusalem accidentally uncovered a Jewish tomb dated to the 1st century. Inside were the skeletal remains of a man in his 20s who had been crucified. The heel bone had been pierced by an iron nail 11.5 centimeters in length. Research on the remains indicate that each foot was nailed separately, but no evidence was found of traumatic injury to the forearms. This indicates that sometimes the arms were tied to the horizontal bar of the cross, but written accounts of Roman crucifixion indicate that the hands were more typically nailed as well as the feet.
Jesus would have been exhausted from the blood loss from his back and from the exertion of carrying the cross to the outskirts of the city. His body would have been thrown backwards with his shoulders against the wood. The legionnaire would have felt for the depression at the front of the wrist and nailed in that area. Then the other wrist. The knees would have been bent slightly before nailing the feet into place. With the toes pointing away from the body, the nails would have been punched through the arch or the heel. At that point, the cross would have been lifted into place as he slowly sagged from the weight of his body, with more and more pressure on the nail entry points. He would have felt an excruciating, fiery pain shoot along the fingers and up the arms to explode in the brain. The nails in the wrist were putting pressure on the median nerves. As he tried to push himself up to avoid this stretching torment, he would have placed the full weight on the nail through his feet. Again, he felt the searing agony of the nail tearing through the nerves between the bones of his feet. Standing near the cross were the mother of Jesus and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom Jesus loved standing beside her. He said to his mother, and to the disciple he said, and from that hour the disciple took her into his own home. It would have been difficult for Jesus to speak from the cross at all, as his arms became fatigued. Cramps swept through the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps would have come the inability to push himself upward to breathe. Air could be drawn into the lungs, but not exhaled, because the two muscles needed for exhaling, the diaphragm and the intercostalis muscles between the ribs, were impeded. Jesus would have had to fight to raise himself in order to get even one small breath. Finally, carbon dioxide would build up in the lungs and in the bloodstream, and the cramps would partially subside. Spasmodically, he was able to push himself upward to exhale, and bring in life-giving oxygen. When Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, "A jar full of sour wine was standing there." So they put a sponge full of wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.
There's a line that is drawn through the ages. On that line stands an old rugged cross.
on the cross, a battle is raging for the gain of man's soul or his loss. On one side march the forces of evil, all the demons and devils of hell. But on the other, the angels of glory, and they meet on Golgotha's hill. You see, the earth shakes with the force of the conflict. Oh, the sun refuses to shine. Oh, but there hangs God's Son in the balance. Oh, and there, through the darkness, he cried, "It is finished." The battle is over. It is finished. There'll be no more war. It is finished. The end of the conflict. Oh, it is finished. And Jesus is Lord. Yet in my heart, this battle was still raging. See, not all prisoners of war had come home. You see, they were battlefields of my own making. You see, this man didn't know that the war had been won. But check this out. You see, then I heard that the King of the ages, you see, he had fought all the battles for me, yeah. And in victory, it's yours and yours and yours and mine for the pain. Oh, and right now, in the Navy Center, oh, I'm free, I'm free, I'm free. It is finished. The battle is over. It is finished. There will be no more war. It is finished. The end of the conflict. Oh, it is finished. And Jesus is Lord. He's Lord. It is finished. And Jesus is Lord. Jesus
joint rending cramps, intermittent partial asphyxiation, searing pain as tissue was torn from his lacerated back as he moved up and down against the rough timber. Then another agony began, a deep, crushing pain deep in the chest as the pericardium slowly filled with serum and began to compress the heart. It was then almost over. The loss of tissue fluids had reached a critical level, the compressed heart struggling to pump heavy, sluggish blood into the tissues. The tortured lungs making a frantic effort to gasp in small gulps of air. He could feel the chill of death creeping through his tissues. Finally, he could allow his body to die.
We can't forget God's sacrifice. He saved this world with his son's life. He must have agonized in grief to watch his child suffer and bleed. But he knew that the blood that his son spilled there would save this world from her despair. So then over 2,000 years ago, God put his power into the flood. The sins of the world could not pollute the years and time, could not dilute Jesus' blood. Still washes your tears. So now, if you need healing for your life, you've tossed and turned and prayed all night because the doctor said to you, there is nothing he could do. Well, my friend, no matter how you feel, keep saying by his stripes I'm healed. That's when the blood will take control and let his healing virtue flow. Jesus' blood is covering you. Every sickness, demon,
Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, although he followed Jesus in secret because he was afraid of the religious leaders, asked Pilate to let him take the body of Jesus away. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and removed the body of Jesus from the cross. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with the spices in linen cloths, according to the burial custom of the Jews. Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and in the garden there was a tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And so, because it was a Jewish day of preparation, and the body was nearby, they laid Jesus there.
He left a throne in heaven to come to Bethlehem, and I could not forget the way he loved me even then. And everywhere he traveled, he spoke with words of love that said he'll go to any distance to show what I was worthy of. And when at last that dusty road turned to Calvary, he picked up a rugged burden so that one day I could see. He loved me with the cross. He loved me with the cross. In answer to the call of love, he loved me with the cross. He knew from the beginning the price he'd have to pay, for his love had gone so far beyond what other loves forgave. I wasn't on that hillside to see him on the tree, but as my guilt was placed upon him, I know that somehow he saw me. He loved me with the cross. He loved me with the cross. In answer to the call of love, he loved me with the cross. Though I could not imagine what
me would cost. My Jesus, he went to Calvary and loved me with the cross. And I would be a sinner still, enslaved by all my sin, if it had not been for Jesus and the way he loved me then. He loved me with the cross. He loved me with the cross. In answer to the call of love, he loved me with the cross. Though I could not imagine what